Settle in, find a comfortable position, and allow the day to slowly loosen its grip. Tonight, you're invited into a quiet corner of American history. A time before bright pharmacies and printed labels, when healing was shaped by memory, nature, and whispered tradition. As this story unfolds, your only task is to listen. Or not listen at all. To let your breathing slow and drift gently toward deep natural sleep. If you find comfort here, you're welcome to subscribe, not as a task, but as a way of returning whenever rest feels distant. And before you fully drift away, you may leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight, a city, a small town, or a quiet place between, so this story can travel softly across the night. From one resting listener to another. Now, let the lights dim, let the past grow gentle, and let sleep arrive, quietly, on its own time. Long before medicine arrived in neat bottles with printed labels, it lived quietly in other places. It rested in memory, passed from one voice to another. It waited on kitchen shelves beside sacks of flour and jars of preserved fruit. It grew slowly in the wilderness, rooted in forests, fields, and along riverbanks, known not by Latin names, but by stories. In early America, the idea of a pharmacy was not a building, it was an understanding, a shared knowledge shaped by observation, habit, and hope. People did not speak of prescriptions or manufacturers. Instead, they spoke of what their parents had used, what their neighbors trusted, what the land itself seemed willing to offer. At night, when oil lamps flickered and the day's labor finally loosened its hold, these remedies were often prepared. A kettle warmed on the hearth, leaves dried carefully on cloth, roots cleaned and set aside. The acts themselves were slow, familiar, and calming, as if the process of preparation mattered as much as the remedy itself. Illness, in those days, was rarely dramatic at first. It arrived quietly, like fatigue that lingered too long, or a cough that refused to fade. Without easy access to trained physicians who were scarce, distant, or expensive, families turned inward to what they knew and what they could reach. Care began at home, with patience rather than urgency. The kitchen became a place of gentle attention, not a laboratory, but a space of routine and calm. Wooden tables bore the marks of years of use. Shelves held bundles of dried plants tied with twine. The air carried the soft scent of herbs, smoke, and warm bread. In these spaces, healing was woven into daily life rather than separated from it. Outside, the wilderness played its quiet role. Early Americans lived close to the land, often out of necessity rather than choice. Forests were not distant retreats, but constant neighbors. Fields were not scenery, but sustenance. Within them grew plants whose uses were learned slowly, sometimes cautiously, sometimes through trial and error. Knowledge of these plants did not come from books at first. It came from watching seasons change, noticing patterns, and listening carefully to those who had lived on the land longer. This understanding was practical, shaped by survival, and deeply tied to place. What grew in one region became trusted there, while other areas developed their own quiet traditions. Medicine then was not standardized. It varied from valley to valley, from one settlement to the next. What comforted one family might be unknown to another just a few miles away. This variety was not seen as a problem. It was simply how life unfolded, local, personal, and shaped by circumstance. There was also a sense of ritual woven into these practices. Remedies were often prepared in familiar ways, at familiar times. The repetition itself was soothing. Measuring was done by feel rather than scale. Timing followed instinct more than instruction. These gentle rhythms offered reassurance, even when outcomes were uncertain. Stories accompanied these practices. Someone remembered how a relative once recovered after a certain preparation. Another recalled a neighbor who swore by a particular method. Over time, these stories gained weight, not because they were proven, but because they were remembered. Memory itself became a form of evidence. In this world, medicine did not promise certainty. It offered comfort, care, and the sense that something was being done. That alone carried meaning. To prepare a remedy was to acknowledge illness without panic. It was a way of responding thoughtfully rather than helplessly. silence played its part as well. There were moments when nothing more could be done than to wait. Waiting, too, became a skill. Sitting quietly by the fire, listening to breathing slow, trusting time. In these moments, the line between medicine and rest blurred, and stillness itself felt like part of the remedy. This forgotten pharmacy was not hidden behind locked doors. It was open to anyone willing to learn and observe. Children grew up watching these quiet acts, absorbing knowledge without formal instruction. Over years, familiarity replaced fear. The unknown became manageable through routine and care. As America slowly expanded, these practices traveled with settlers, tucked into memory rather than luggage. Even when landscapes changed, the habit of turning to the familiar remained. New plants were learned, old ones adapted. The pharmacy evolved without ever becoming fixed. There is something deeply calming in remembering this slower world. A time when solutions were not instant, and patience was expected. When care was personal, and healing was not rushed. When the boundary between daily life and medicine barely existed at all. Tonight, as this story begins, there is no need to judge these practices or measure their effectiveness. They belong to their time, shaped by the knowledge and limits of that era. What matters here is the atmosphere they created, a quiet attentiveness to the body, the home, and the land. Let this opening linger gently. Imagine the soft glow of lamplight, the steady presence of familiar rooms, the slow passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. In this forgotten pharmacy, nothing is urgent. Nothing demands action. Everything moves at the pace of breath and memory. And as these images settle, you may find your thoughts growing quieter too, drifting naturally as the story continues onward, deeper into the gentle past. In early America, distance shaped nearly every part of life. Homes were spread far apart, connected by narrow paths rather than roads. Towns were small, and beyond them stretched long miles of forest, field, and open sky. In this quiet expanse, illness did not arrive to the sound of bells or hurried footsteps. It came softly, meeting isolation as a familiar companion. When someone fell unwell, help was rarely close. A trained physician might live days away, reachable only by rough travel and uncertain weather. Even if one could be summoned, there was no guarantee of timely arrival. And so, most families learned early that care would begin and often end at home. This reality shaped a particular kind of calm. There was little room for panic. People understood that waiting was part of life. They adjusted their expectations, not because they lacked concern, but because urgency served no purpose when distance could not be overcome. Households became quiet centers of care. Beds were moved closer to the hearth for warmth. Windows were opened just enough to allow fresh air without inviting cold. Simple comforts, clean linens, water brought carefully from the well. Food prepared slowly formed the foundation of healing. Isolation, though challenging, also encouraged attentiveness. With fewer outside voices, families listened more closely to one another. Small changes were noticed: a cough easing, a fever breaking, a breath slowing during sleep. These signs mattered deeply, observed not by instruments, but by presence. Nighttime held a special stillness. Without the glow of city lights, darkness arrived fully, wrapping the household in quiet. In these hours, caregivers often sat awake, listening. The soft crackle of firewood, the rhythmic ticking of a clock, if one was owned, the sound of breathing in the next room. These were the measures of time and reassurance. Illness in isolation also fostered resilience. People learned to trust themselves. Decisions were made thoughtfully, guided by experience rather than instruction. What had helped before was tried again. What had not was set aside. This slow accumulation of wisdom became essential. Neighbors, though distant, were not forgotten. When possible, word was sent quietly, someone riding out at first light, or passing news along a familiar route. Assistance, when it arrived, was practical and unspoken. A basket of food, an offer to tend animals, a moment of shared silence. Community existed, even across distance. Yet often, no one came. And in those moments, households learned to stand alone without despair. There was dignity in self-reliance. but also a deep gentleness. Care was not hurried. There was time to sit, to speak softly, to rest. Children grew up watching these scenes. They learned early that illness was part of life, not an interruption of it. They saw adults respond with patience rather than fear. Over time, this shaped a quiet confidence, a belief that challenges could be met calmly. The land itself reinforced isolation. Rivers swelled, paths disappeared in snow or mud, and seasons dictated movement. During long winters, travel became nearly impossible. Families settled inward, making the home not just a shelter, but a complete world. In these closed seasons, illness felt even more solitary. Yet there was also a sense of safety. The outside world grew distant, allowing focus to narrow to the essentials: warmth, nourishment, rest. These were the priorities, simple and steady. Without constant outside intervention, people became skilled at noticing rhythms. How long discomfort lasted, how rest affected recovery, when to act and when to wait. This understanding was intuitive, shaped by observation rather than theory. Silence was accepted. There were hours when nothing was done because nothing needed to be done. Sitting quietly became an act of care. It allowed the body its own space to recover. Without pressure or expectation, there is something deeply peaceful in this memory of isolation, a world where help did not arrive instantly, but where presence made up the difference, where care was measured in time given, not treatments applied as modern life hums with constant connection. This earlier stillness feels almost unreal, yet it shaped generations, teaching them to rely on patience, observation, and the quiet strength of routine. Tonight, as you listen, imagine that slower pace, a household wrapped in silence, a lamp glowing softly, someone keeping watch, not anxiously, but steadily. Outside, the land rests. Inside, care unfolds at its own gentle speed. In that stillness, isolation loses its sharp edges. It becomes a space for attention, for calm, for trust in the gradual passing of time. And as these images settle, the mind, too, may find its own quiet, drifting gently onward into the next part of the story. Before medicine became standardized, before measurements were exact and names were printed clearly on labels, healing in America existed in a wide and wandering landscape. It was shaped not by uniform rules, but by environment, belief, and a quiet, persistent hope. Each place offered something different, and each family learned to listen to what their surroundings seemed willing to give. The land itself was the first influence. Early Americans lived within ecosystems that changed dramatically from region to region. Coastal air felt different from mountain air. Forests offered one kind of abundance, plains another. What people believed could help them often depended on what grew nearby, what animals they observed, and how the seasons unfolded around them. In wooded areas, trees were seen not only as shelter and fuel, but as sources of possibility. Bark, leaves, and sap were gathered carefully, often with a sense of respect. These materials were not taken hastily. There was an understanding, sometimes spoken, sometimes simply felt, that the land needed time to renew itself. In open fields and grasslands, attention shifted downward. Roots, low-growing plants, and wildflowers became familiar companions. Their presence marked the changing months. When certain plants appeared, people noticed. When they faded, it was accepted as part of a larger rhythm. Healing followed these same patterns, unhurried and seasonal. Belief filled the spaces where certainty was missing. Without clear explanations for why the body suffered or recovered, meaning was often shaped through stories. Some believed balance was key between heat and cold, rest and work, quiet and motion. Others trusted symbols, signs, and traditions passed down without question. These beliefs were not always rigid. They evolved quietly over time. A remedy that seemed helpful earned trust. One that failed gently faded away. This process was slow, guided more by memory than by instruction. There was no authority to declare what was correct. Instead, experience quietly decided. Hope played an essential role. To prepare a remedy was to express belief in recovery. Even when outcomes were uncertain, the act of care carried reassurance. Hope did not promise results, but it softened fear. It gave people something to hold on to during long nights and quiet days. In this era, medicine was not separate from daily life. It moved alongside chores, meals, and rest. Someone might gather plants in the morning, prepare food at midday, and tend to an unwell family member in the evening, all without shifting roles. Care was woven seamlessly into routine. The lack of standardization also meant there was no single way to heal. What worked in one place might be unknown elsewhere. This diversity was accepted without conflict. There was little sense of comparison. Each household trusted its own knowledge, shaped by its own landscape. Time moved differently in this world. Without schedules dictated by appointments or instructions, healing followed the body's pace. Some recoveries were slow, marked by gradual improvement. Others were sudden, surprising everyone involved. Both were accepted with equal calm. Waiting became part of the process. Waiting for a season to change. Waiting for strength to return. Waiting without constant evaluation. This patience created space for rest, not just for the body, but for the mind as well. The environment also influenced how illness was understood. Harsh winters encouraged warmth and stillness. Hot summers invited cooling breezes and shade. People adjusted their care in response to weather. Trusting nature's cues more than abstract ideas, sound and silence mattered too. Without constant noise, small changes were easier to notice. The tone of a voice, the depth of sleep, the rhythm of breath, these observations guided decisions gently, without urgency. Children absorbed these patterns naturally. They learned that healing was not dramatic. It was often quiet, repetitive, and slow. They saw adults respond with steadiness rather than alarm, and this shaped how they understood care throughout their lives. There was also room for mystery. Not everything needed explanation. Some things simply were. A recovery might be attributed to time, rest, or grace. The absence of answers did not always cause discomfort. Sometimes, it brought peace. Looking back, this wild landscape of early healing feels distant from modern life. Yet there is something deeply soothing in remembering it. A time when care was personal, shaped by surroundings rather than systems. When belief and hope worked quietly together, without needing proof. As you listen, imagine that open world. No fixed rules. No sharp boundaries. Just land, people, and the slow unfolding of care. Let the sense of openness settle. Let the pace soften, and as the story continues, allow yourself to drift gently through this earlier time, where healing followed the rhythms of nature and rest came naturally, without demand. Long before settlers built homes or cleared fields, knowledge already lived quietly beneath the forest canopy. It was not written down or organized into volumes. Instead, it moved through generations in careful words, shared experiences, and patient observation. This wisdom belonged to the land and to the people who listened closely to it. For indigenous communities, the natural world was not separate from daily life. Plants were not simply objects to be used, but living presences with seasons, rhythms, and relationships. Knowledge of roots, leaves, bark, and berries developed slowly, shaped by long familiarity with place. This understanding was not hurried, and it was never casual. Learning began early. Children watched adults gather plants with care, noticing where they grew and when they returned each year. They learned that timing mattered. Some plants were best gathered at dawn, others in quiet afternoons. Some were left untouched until the right season arrived. Patience was part of the lesson. Under the tall trees, the forest offered guidance. Changes in light, moisture, and temperature signaled subtle shifts. A plant's appearance, its scent, and even the way it responded to touch were observed closely. This attention fostered respect, not control. Taking from the land required awareness of balance. Knowledge was shared gently, often through storytelling rather than instruction. Stories carried lessons about when to gather, how much to take, and when to let the land rest. These stories were not rushed. They were repeated over time, allowing meaning to deepen naturally. Natural cycles shaped understanding. The return of certain plants marked seasons of growth and rest. Illness and recovery were seen as part of these larger rhythms. Just as the forest experienced periods of abundance and quiet, so did the human body. Healing was not forced. It was allowed. This perspective encouraged attentiveness rather than urgency. When discomfort appeared, it was observed within the context of the whole environment, season, and spirit. Care was thoughtful, guided by experience rather than haste. Roots held particular significance. Hidden beneath the surface, they required careful effort to find. Their presence symbolized depth and patience. Gathering them involved intention, respect, and often ceremony. Nothing was taken without acknowledgement. Leaves and bark were treated similarly. Trees were not stripped or damaged unnecessarily. The idea of sustainability was lived rather than defined. By taking only what was needed, communities ensured the land's generosity would continue. Knowledge was not owned by individuals. It belonged to the community and the land itself. Elders carried experience, but wisdom was shared, not hoarded. This openness created continuity, allowing traditions to survive changes in environment and circumstance. When European settlers arrived, they encountered this deep understanding, though it was not always recognized or respected. Still, fragments of indigenous knowledge found their way into broader use, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes not. Plants that had been known quietly for generations entered new narratives. Yet the original wisdom remained grounded in relationship. It was never about domination or extraction. It emphasized listening, restraint, and trust in natural processes. Healing was seen as a collaboration with the land, not a conquest over it. Silence played an important role. Observation required stillness. Gathering often happened without unnecessary words. In that quiet, understanding deepened. The forest itself became a teacher, offering lessons without speaking. There was also humility in this approach. Not every plant was safe. Not every condition could be addressed. Limits were accepted without frustration. Knowing when not to act was as important as knowing when to act. This balance created calm. Fear did not dominate care. Instead, there was trust in time, cycles, and the body's ability to move toward balance. This trust softened anxiety, allowing rest to become part of healing. As generations passed, this wisdom adapted without losing its core. Even as landscapes changed and pressures increased, the emphasis on respect and observation endured. Knowledge continued to flow, quietly resilient. Tonight, as you imagine this world beneath the forest canopy, let the pace slow. Picture filtered sunlight touching leaves. Hear the soft sounds of wind and distant movement. Feel the steadiness of cycles unfolding without urgency. This wisdom does not ask to be used or proven. It asks only to be remembered with respect. As the story continues, allow this sense of calm attentiveness to settle within you, like the forest settling into evening, where knowledge rests gently and nothing needs to be rushed. When ships crossed the Atlantic toward an unfamiliar continent, they carried more than people and provisions. Tucked quietly among clothing, tools, and keepsakes were beliefs shaped by centuries of life in Europe. These beliefs were not always written down. Many lived only in memory, passed from parent to child, neighbor to neighbor, carried as naturally as language itself. For those leaving the old world, these traditions offered comfort. The journey was long, uncertain, and often frightening. Familiar ideas about health and illness helped anchor people during change. Even as coastlines disappeared behind them, the habits of thought remained close. European folk beliefs about healing had grown from long histories of hardship. Wars, plagues, and harsh winters had taught people to rely on what they could understand and control. Remedies often reflected a desire for balance between hot and cold, dry and damp, rest and movement. These ideas were simple, intuitive, and deeply rooted. When settlers arrived in America, the landscape challenged nearly everything they knew. The plants were different. The climate shifted dramatically. Familiar remedies were not always possible. Yet the beliefs themselves did not vanish. Instead, they adapted quietly, reshaped by necessity. Fear played a subtle role in this transformation. Illness in an unfamiliar land felt more threatening. Without extended family networks or established communities, uncertainty grew heavier. Old beliefs offered reassurance, even when evidence was unclear. Familiar practices became a way to push back against fear. Some traditions survived largely unchanged. Rituals, timing, and preparation methods remained recognizable, even as ingredients shifted. Others evolved more noticeably, blending old logic with new scriptings. What mattered most was not strict accuracy, but continuity. European settlers often believed illness had meaning beyond the physical. It could be a sign of imbalance, environment, or unseen forces. This perspective shaped care gently. Rather than focusing only on symptoms, attention was given to rest, surroundings, and routine. In the New World, these beliefs met unfamiliar challenges. Long winters, intense summers, and isolation forced adjustments. People observed what seemed to help and what did not. Over time, certain ideas softened, while others grew stronger through repetition. Stories played a powerful role in this process. Someone remembered a remedy that had helped long ago. Another recalled a warning passed down through generations. These stories offered guidance when certainty was impossible. They also created a sense of connection to the past. The kitchen once again became central. Old habits found new expressions there. Preparation was slow and deliberate, echoing life left behind. In these familiar motions, settlers found comfort and control amid change. Not all beliefs were gentle. Some were shaped by deep fear of illness spreading, of unseen dangers, of loss. These fears sometimes led to practices that now seem puzzling. Yet within their historical context, they reflected a desire for safety and order in a world that felt unpredictable. Over time, experience softened these edges. As settlers became more familiar with their environment, fear gave way to observation. Old ideas were tested quietly against new realities. Some faded naturally, others merged with new knowledge, forming something distinct. This quiet transformation happened without announcement. There were no declarations of change. Beliefs shifted gradually, shaped by lived experience rather than debate. What remained was what felt helpful, familiar, or comforting. European traditions did not dominate this process alone. They encountered other ways of understanding health and the land. Through proximity and observation, settlers absorbed ideas that differed from their own. Sometimes this happened consciously, sometimes without awareness. The result was not a replacement, but a blending. Old world logic met new world conditions. Practices adjusted without losing their emotional foundation. Healing remained personal, rooted in memory and routine. There is something soothing in this slow evolution. No sudden breaks, no sharp endings, just gradual change, guided by necessity and experience. Beliefs were not discarded lightly. They were carried forward, reshaped gently by time. As generations passed, these adapted traditions became part of American life. Their origins blurred. What once belonged to distant villages now felt native to new soil. Memory softened, but habits endured. Tonight, imagine that quiet crossing. A ship moving steadily across dark water. People resting below deck, holding on to familiar thoughts. The past traveling silently with them, ready to change, but not disappear. Let this sense of continuity settle. Beliefs moving slowly, adapting without conflict. Old fears easing into new understanding. And as this chapter fades, allow yourself to drift gently onward, carried by the same quiet patience that guided these traditions across the sea and into a new world. The meeting of cultures in early America was rarely simple, and it was never instant. Ideas did not merge overnight, and traditions did not disappear all at once. Instead, they moved toward one another slowly, shaped by daily life, quiet observation, and shared necessity. Nowhere was this gradual blending more subtle than in the ways people understood care, healing, and the natural world. Indigenous communities and European settlers often lived close to one another, whether by choice or circumstance. They shared landscapes, weather, and the challenges of survival. Over time, proximity encouraged attention. People noticed how others gathered plants, prepared food, or responded to illness. Curiosity, sometimes cautious and sometimes reluctant, opened small spaces for learning. This exchange rarely happened through formal teaching. It unfolded in moments, watching someone select a plant, hearing a story repeated, noticing what seemed to bring comfort. Knowledge moved quietly, often without names or explanations. What mattered was not who owned the knowledge, but whether it helped people endure the realities of frontier life. European practices brought with them familiar frameworks, ideas of balance, routine, and ritual. Indigenous understanding offered deep familiarity with the land itself. Together, these approaches began to overlap. Settlers learned which plants thrived locally, while indigenous communities observed how newcomers adapted old beliefs to new environments. The blending was uneven and varied by region. In some areas, exchange was more visible. In others, it remained subtle. But across the continent, small shifts accumulated. A plant once ignored became valued. A method once unfamiliar became routine. These changes were not recorded, yet they shaped daily life. Belief systems, too, adjusted. European ideas about illness expanded as settlers encountered different ways of understanding the body's relationship to nature. Healing became less about control and more about harmony. At the same time, indigenous practices encountered new tools, materials, and influences, adapting without losing their core respect for balance. Language itself reflected this intertwining. Words changed meaning. Names of plants blended across cultures. Stories absorbed new details while retaining familiar rhythms. Over generations, origins blurred, and what remained felt natural, even inevitable. This process was driven largely by necessity. Life on the frontier demanded flexibility. Rigid adherence to one system rarely served well in an unfamiliar environment. Practical solutions were valued, regardless of where they came from. Over time, usefulness mattered more than tradition alone. There was also a shared respect for patience. Both traditions recognized that healing often took time. Rest, observation, and attentiveness were central. This common ground allowed ideas to align without conflict. The kitchen and the outdoors remained central spaces for this blending. Preparation methods shifted gradually. Gathering practices became more mindful of local cycles. Even the timing of care adapted to seasons and environment. These changes felt organic rather than imposed. Children grew up within this blended world. They did not separate practices by origin. What they learned felt simply like how things were done. This generation carried forward a new, quiet synthesis without needing to name it. In many ways, this intertwining created something distinctly American. Not fully European, not fully indigenous, but shaped by both and adapted to the realities of the land. Healing practices became reflections of place rather than lineage alone. This blending was not without tension or loss, yet within daily life, it often unfolded gently. People sought comfort, stability, and familiarity. They borrowed what worked, adjusted what did not, and allowed habits to evolve naturally. Silence played a role here as well. Much of this exchange happened without documentation or recognition. Knowledge moved through observation rather than conversation. This quiet transfer allowed ideas to settle without resistance. Looking back, it is easy to imagine clear boundaries between traditions. But lived experience rarely fits such lines. Instead, understanding flowed where it was needed, crossing cultural edges softly. Tonight, imagine this gradual weaving. Threads of knowledge, crossing, looping, and settling into a shared fabric. No single pattern dominating, just a growing sense of coherence shaped by time. As this chapter continues, allow that image to rest in your mind. Traditions, meeting without urgency, learning without force. And as the story drifts onward, let your thoughts soften too. Following the same gentle pace that shaped this uniquely American blend of understanding in the quiet world of early American homes, certain plants slowly gathered reputations that far exceeded their modest appearance. They did not announce themselves with bright colors or unusual shapes. Many blended easily into fields, forests, and gardens. Yet over time, through repeated use and steady memory, they became familiar companions, spoken of with a kind of quiet respect. These plants were not famous all at once. Their reputations grew gradually, shaped by stories rather than records. Someone remembered how a particular leaf had once brought comfort. Another recalled a root that was always kept nearby, just in case. Over years, these recollections layered gently upon one another, turning ordinary growth into household legend. Trees often held a special place in these stories. Tall, patient, and enduring, they seemed to embody stability itself. Their bark, leaves, or sap were gathered carefully, usually from the same tree, year after year. Familiarity bred trust. The tree became part of the household's extended world, noticed in every season, unchanged even as people came and went. Herbs too found their way into daily routines. Grown near doorways or tucked into small garden plots, they were easy to reach and easy to remember. Their presence was reassuring. Simply seeing them return each spring marked continuity. A reminder that life moved forward as it always had. Roots carried a different kind of meaning. Hidden beneath the surface, they required effort to uncover. Digging for them was done deliberately, often with a sense of care. Because they were not always visible, they felt rare, even when they were common. Their mystery added to their reputation. What united these plants was not dramatic effect, but consistency. They were trusted because they were familiar. Generation after generation, they appeared in the same places, used in the same ways. Over time, this repetition created confidence. Stories played a central role in shaping these legends. They were told quietly, often without embellishment. "This is what we've always used," someone might say. The phrase carried weight, not because of proof, but because of time. Longevity itself became a form of validation. The plant's appearances rarely hinted at their importance. Some had small leaves, pale flowers, or plain bark. To an outsider, they might seem unremarkable, but to those who knew them, they were part of the household's rhythm, as familiar as furniture or tools. Their use often coincided with moments of stillness. Preparation was slow. Leaves were dried, roots cleaned, bark set aside. These acts invited calm. They created space for attention and care. Regardless of outcome, children learned these plants by sight long before they learned their names. They knew where they grew, when they returned, and how they were treated. This familiarity came without explanation. It was absorbed naturally, like language or habit. As families moved, these legends traveled with them, not always physically, but in memory. When the same plant appeared in a new place, it felt like recognition. When it did not, something similar might take its place, inheriting the reputation through resemblance or story. Over time, these plants became woven into identity. A household might be known for always keeping a certain herb nearby, or for tending a particular tree carefully. These associations were gentle and unspoken, yet deeply felt. There was comfort in this familiarity. In a world filled with uncertainty, knowing what grew nearby and how it had been used before offered reassurance. These plants did not promise certainty, but they offered continuity. Their legends were never fixed. They shifted subtly as stories changed, as experiences accumulated. Some plants slowly faded from use, their reputations softening. Others endured, becoming symbols of tradition rather than practice. Looking back, it is easy to romanticize these household legends, but their true power lay in their quiet presence. They asked little attention. They did not demand belief. They simply existed, steady and familiar. Tonight, imagine these plants as they once were, growing quietly at the edge of fields, along paths, beneath trees. Imagine hands reaching for them without hurry. Imagine stories whispered, repeated, remembered. As these images settle, let their simplicity bring calm. Let the idea of small, familiar things holding gentle meaning ease your thoughts. And as the story continues, allow yourself to drift onward, accompanied by these quiet legends that asked nothing more than patience and time. As the quiet traditions of early American healing unfolded, not every remedy rested comfortably in familiarity. Some practices, remembered softly through time, now sound unusual, sometimes puzzling, sometimes almost dreamlike. Yet in their own moment, these remedies made sense, shaped by symbolism, belief, and a deep human desire to understand the unseen. In an age without clear explanations for illness, meaning filled the spaces where knowledge had not yet arrived. People searched for patterns. They noticed what seemed to follow recovery, even when cause and effect were uncertain. Over time, these observations blended with imagination, tradition, and hope. Ingredients were chosen not only for what they did, but for what they represented. Something bitter might be associated with strength. Something rare might be believed to hold special power. The logic was not scientific by modern standards, but it was thoughtful in its own way. Guided by symbolism rather than measurement, many remedies reflected a belief in balance. If illness felt heavy, lightness was sought. If discomfort felt sharp, softness was introduced. This symbolic reasoning shaped choices quietly, without argument. It felt intuitive, even comforting. Some ingredients came from animals, gathered respectfully, and used sparingly. Others came from unexpected places, ashes, stones, or materials that held cultural meaning. These choices were rarely random. They were rooted in stories passed down over generations. Stories that connected the physical world to deeper ideas. Faith played a gentle role. Not faith in a single doctrine, but faith in order itself, the belief that the world, though mysterious, followed certain patterns. To prepare a remedy was to participate in that order, to act rather than surrender to uncertainty. These practices were often accompanied by ritual. Preparation followed familiar steps. Timing mattered. Silence or spoken words added intention. The ritual itself provided calm, creating a sense of control in moments when little else felt stable. From a modern perspective, some of these remedies may seem impractical or strange, but judging them by today's standards misses their purpose. They were never only about outcomes. They were about reassurance, continuity, and meaning. Observation still played a role. People noticed when something appeared to help, even if they did not understand why. Over time, stories accumulated. A remedy that coincided with comfort gained trust. One that failed quietly faded away. Symbolism also allowed people to externalize fear. Illness could feel overwhelming, invisible, and unpredictable. Assigning meaning to ingredients made the experience manageable. It turned uncertainty into action. Children grew up surrounded by these practices. To them, they were normal, woven into daily life. They learned that care could take many forms, some practical, some symbolic, all rooted in attention and concern. Even when remedies were unusual, the intent behind them was gentle. Caregivers acted with patience and hope. The goal was comfort, not control. This intention softened outcomes, regardless of effectiveness. Over time, some of these practices were questioned, adapted, or set aside. As understanding grew, symbolism gave way to explanation. Yet the emotional role of these remedies remained important. They remind us that healing has always involved more than the body alone. There is something calming in acknowledging this aspect of the past. A time when people accepted mystery without frustration, when faith and observation coexisted without conflict, when not knowing did not mean doing nothing. Tonight, imagine a quiet room, a remedy prepared slowly. Not in haste, but with care. Imagine the calm that comes from familiar steps, even when answers are unclear. Let that sense of gentle intention settle. As this chapter fades, allow yourself to rest in the understanding that these strange ingredients and stranger faith were expressions of hope. They were ways of caring in an uncertain world. And as the story continues, let that quiet hope guide you onward, easing the mind and inviting rest. In the long, quiet history of early American care, there were moments that lingered in memory, not because they were understood, but because they seemed to help. These were times when a practice or preparation, simple, unexpected, or even puzzling, appeared to bring comfort. No explanations followed. There were no theories to confirm why relief came. There was only the experience, remembered softly and repeated when needed. These moments often began without expectation. Someone tried what had been suggested, not with confidence, but with hope. The act itself was unremarkable. What followed a quiet easing, a longer stretch of rest. A calmer night stood out only because it was noticed. Observation played a central role. Without tools or training to analyze outcomes, people relied on attention. They watched for small changes. They listened for differences in breath, tone, and rest. When something seemed to improve, it was remembered. The practices themselves were often simple. A familiar routine adjusted slightly, a plant prepared differently, a quiet ritual repeated at the same time each evening. These changes were not dramatic. Their impact, when felt, was gentle rather than sudden. Because explanations were unavailable, meaning filled the gap. People spoke of luck, timing, or balance. Some believed comfort came because care was taken with patience. Others felt it was simply the body finding its way back to rest. The absence of certainty did not diminish the experience. Stories formed around these moments. They were shared without embellishment. It seemed to help, someone would say. The phrase was enough. It did not claim success. It simply acknowledged comfort. Over time, these stories gained quiet authority, not because they were proven, but because they were repeated. Familiarity lent them weight. In a world shaped by uncertainty, remembered comfort mattered deeply. Faith, in its simplest form, accompanied these practices. Not faith in guaranteed outcomes, but faith in the act of caring itself. Doing something, however small, felt better than doing nothing. It restored a sense of agency. These unlikely moments often coincided with rest. When activity slowed, when attention turned inward, when nights grew quieter, perhaps it was the pause itself that mattered. Or perhaps it was the reassurance of being cared for. Children absorbed these lessons naturally. They learned that healing was not always logical, that comfort could come from unexpected places, that patience mattered as much as action. The environment shaped these experiences. Silence made changes easier to notice. Without distraction, subtle shifts stood out. A longer sleep, a calmer morning. These small improvements felt significant. Over generations, some of these practices endured, others faded as understanding grew. But the memory of those unlikely moments remained. They remind us that healing has always involved more than explanation. There is a quiet humility in this part of history. People did not claim mastery over illness. They accepted mystery without resentment. They acted with care, then waited. This acceptance created calm. Anxiety softened when outcomes were not forced. Attention turned toward comfort rather than control. Tonight, imagine one of these moments. A room lit softly, someone resting. A simple act repeated with patience. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed. Just quiet presence. As this chapter settles, let that stillness extend to you. Let go of the need to understand everything. Allow comfort to arrive in its own way. And as the story continues, drift onward, guided by the same gentle trust that shaped these unlikely moments long ago. As gentle as many early healing traditions were, not all were harmless. Beneath the calm routines and familiar stories, there existed practices shaped less by understanding and more by fear. These dangers were rarely dramatic or intentional. They unfolded quietly, carried forward by belief rather than knowledge, and accepted because alternatives were few. In a world without clear explanations for illness, fear filled the unknown. When pain lingered or symptoms worsened, imagination often stepped in. People searched for reasons, something to blame, something to correct. Without the benefit of science or shared information, conclusions were drawn carefully, but not always accurately. Some remedies emerged from the belief that illness had to be forced out, rather than soothed. Discomfort was sometimes seen as something that needed to be challenged or countered aggressively. These ideas were not cruel in intention. They reflected desperation and a desire to act. When waiting felt unbearable, what made these practices particularly dangerous was their familiarity. When something had been done for generations, it felt safe, simply because it was known. Repetition created trust, even when outcomes were uncertain. Harm, when it occurred, was often attributed to fate rather than cause. Fear shaped interpretation. If someone improved after a practice, it was remembered. If someone did not, the explanation was often external timing, severity, or chance. This selective memory allowed certain beliefs to persist quietly. Silence also played a role. Without broader discussion or comparison, experiences remained isolated. One household's struggles were rarely shared openly. This lack of shared reflection slowed change. Many people believed the body needed correction rather than care. This belief made some practices feel necessary, even when they caused discomfort. Pain was sometimes accepted as part of healing, rather than a sign to stop. Children grew up witnessing these responses, learning that endurance was expected. They absorbed the idea that discomfort could be meaningful, even beneficial. This belief shaped how practices were passed on, rarely questioned. The environment reinforced these patterns. Harsh conditions demanded resilience. When life itself was difficult, discomfort felt normal. Harm was harder to recognize against a backdrop of constant challenge. Yet even within these beliefs, there was gentleness. Caregivers acted with concern, not malice. Their goal was protection, not harm. They trusted what they knew because nothing else was available. Over time, some practices were quietly abandoned. Experience taught limits. Patterns emerged. Certain methods faded as their risks became harder to ignore. This change was gradual, unspoken, and driven by observation rather than instruction. Understanding grew slowly. Fear softened as familiarity with the land and body increased. Practices shaped by panic gave way to those shaped by patience. Looking back, it is important to view these dangers with compassion. They were products of their time, born from uncertainty and a deep desire to protect loved ones. Judgment adds little. Understanding offers more. There is something calming in acknowledging this complexity. History is rarely simple. Care and harm can coexist, shaped by context rather than intent. Tonight, allow this chapter to rest gently. Recognize that fear, when unexamined, can mislead, but that learning often begins quietly. As the story continues, let this awareness settle softly, without alarm, reminding us that progress often comes not from certainty, but from careful attention over time. And as these thoughts fade, let your mind grow quieter, resting in the knowledge that even imperfect care was an expression of hope, and that understanding, like sleep, arrives gradually and gently along the long, uneven roads of early America. Figures appeared and disappeared with the changing seasons. They arrived quietly, sometimes announced by word of mouth, sometimes noticed only when they set down their bags in the town square. These were the traveling healers, wandering practitioners whose presence brought curiosity, hope, and occasionally skepticism to the settlements they passed through. The roads themselves shaped these encounters, dusty in summer, muddy in spring, nearly impassable in winter. They connected isolated communities that otherwise had little contact with the wider world. When a traveler arrived, it was an event, even if unspoken. Movement itself carried meaning. Some of these healers were sincere in their intentions. They carried knowledge gathered through experience, observation, and repetition. Their methods were often simple, shaped by what they could transport and what they had learned along the way. They spoke calmly, worked patiently, and asked little more than hospitality. Others were more theatrical. They understood the power of presentation in places starved for novelty. Bright words, confident gestures, and carefully chosen stories accompanied their arrival. Their performances offered reassurance as much as solutions. In an uncertain world, certainty itself was compelling. Communities greeted these travelers with mixed feelings. Curiosity mingled with caution. People listened, watched, and quietly decided whom to trust. There was no authority to verify claims. Reputation traveled as slowly as the healers themselves. The healers adapted to each place they visited. They learned what people feared, what they hoped for, and what they were willing to believe. This flexibility allowed them to survive on the road, adjusting their approach without necessarily changing their practices. 4 isolated towns. These visits broke the rhythm of daily life. Even those who did not seek care listened to the stories. News traveled with the healers of distant settlements, weather, and changes beyond the horizon. Their presence connected places that otherwise felt alone. Care, when offered, was often brief. Time was limited. The road always called. Treatments, conversations, and exchanges were compressed into short visits. This urgency sometimes heightened belief. Something done once felt more powerful than something repeated daily. The line between sincerity and performance was not always clear. Some healers believed deeply in what they offered. Others believed in the comfort their confidence provided, even if outcomes were uncertain. In many cases, belief itself was the product being shared. People remembered these encounters selectively. If comfort followed, the healer was praised. If not, the visit faded quietly from memory. This pattern allowed reputations to grow or dissolve naturally. The healers themselves were shaped by constant movement. Living on the road required resilience. They learned to read people quickly, to sense trust and doubt. Over time, their practices evolved. Shaped by feedback rather than reflection, these wandering figures became part of local stories. Children remembered their arrival. Adults recalled their words. Whether sincere or theatrical, their presence left impressions that lingered long after they moved on. There was also a quiet loneliness to this life. Always moving, never fully belonging. The road offered freedom, but demanded distance. These healers carried stories, but rarely shared their own. Looking back, it is tempting to categorize them, to label some as genuine and others as false. But such clarity rarely existed in the moment. People accepted complexity without analysis. They took what felt helpful and let the rest pass. Tonight, imagine one of these figures arriving at dusk. A wagon slowing, a bag set down, a small crowd forming quietly, voices low, expectations gentle. As this chapter settles, allow the image of the open road to soften your thoughts. Movement without hurry, encounters without certainty, and as the story continues, drift onward, following the steady pace of those who traveled, not toward answers, but toward the next quiet town under the wide American sky. In early American life, before clinics and waiting rooms, care most often began in the kitchen. This was not a space designed for healing, yet it quietly became the first place people turned when someone felt unwell. Warmth, familiarity, and routine shaped its role, making it a natural center for attention and care. The kitchen was always awake. Long before dawn and long after dusk, it held steady. Fires were lit, water was warmed, food prepared. These daily acts created a rhythm that comforted even when illness disrupted normal life. The constancy of the space itself offered reassurance. Parents and elders guided this care with quiet confidence. Their knowledge came not from instruction, but from experience. They remembered what had been done before, what had seemed to help, and what had not. Memory, rather than measurement, shaped their decisions. Care unfolded slowly here. There was time to sit, to observe, to adjust. A chair drawn closer to the hearth, a cup prepared with care. The pace was unhurried, allowing the body and mind to settle. Elders carried stories as well as skills. They remembered how previous generations had responded to illness. These stories were shared calmly, often without drama. They reassured caregivers that discomfort had been faced before and endured. Patients defined this care. There were no expectations of instant results. Improvement was measured in small ways: restful sleep, a calmer morning, a return of appetite. These signs mattered deeply. Children learned by watching. They saw how attention was given, how voices softened, how tasks slowed. These lessons stayed with them, shaping how they cared for others later in life. The kitchen also offered flexibility. Supplies were nearby. Adjustments could be made easily. Caregivers responded to what they observed, not to instructions written elsewhere. Silence was respected here. There was no need for constant conversation. The sounds of cooking, fire, and gentle movement filled the space naturally. This quiet allowed rest to deepen. Even when practices were uncertain, the intention behind them was clear. Care was given with presence, not haste. This presence itself was healing. As time passed, these kitchens became repositories of shared experience. Knowledge accumulated quietly. Practices evolved without announcement. What remained was what felt right tonight. Imagine such a kitchen. Warm light. Familiar sounds. Someone caring without hurry. Let that calm settle within you as the story continues, honoring the simple, patient care that once began at every hearth. In the long unfolding of early American life, learning rarely arrived all at once. It came gradually, shaped by repetition, reflection, and the quiet passage of years. Without formal instruction or shared systems, families learned through experience, trying what they knew, observing what happened, and adjusting slowly over time. Trial was rarely deliberate experimentation, it was simply life unfolding. Someone did what had been done before because it was familiar. If comfort followed, the practice remained. If it did not, questions formed quietly, even if they were never spoken aloud. Error, when it occurred, was rarely named as such. Instead, practices faded gently. They were set aside without ceremony, replaced by something else, or simply forgotten. There was no sense of failure. Change was accepted as part of living. Time was the true teacher. Years passed. Generations grew older. Memory shifted. What once felt essential gradually became optional. What once seemed uncertain gained trust through repetition. This process required patience. People accepted that understanding would be incomplete. They did not demand certainty. They observed patterns over long periods, trusting that clarity would emerge naturally. Children absorbed these adjustments without noticing. What elders questioned, children accepted as normal. Each generation inherited a slightly altered set of practices, shaped by experiences they did not witness themselves. Some traditions endured because they fit easily into daily life. They were simple, familiar, and gentle. Others demanded effort or caused discomfort and were slowly set aside. Practicality guided survival. Stories played a quiet role in this learning. They preserved memory, but they also changed subtly with retelling. Details softened. Emphasis shifted. Through this process, practices were reshaped without instruction. The environment also influenced change. New regions introduced new conditions. What worked in one place did not always work in another. Adaptation became necessary, encouraging flexibility. There was no rush to decide what was right. Decisions were made gradually, shaped by lived experience rather than debate. This slow pace allowed care to evolve without disruption. Some practices endured not because they were effective, but because they were comforting. Familiarity itself had value. These traditions remained part of routine even as understanding grew. Others faded quietly as people noticed harm or discomfort. Experience taught boundaries. Over time, gentler approaches replaced harsher ones. This quiet learning created resilience. People trusted their ability to adapt. They accepted that care was not fixed, but responsive. Tonight, imagine generations passing knowledge gently forward. No sharp endings. No sudden changes. Just a steady refinement shaped by time. As this chapter settles, allow yourself to rest in that rhythm. Learning, unfolding slowly, without pressure, and as the story continues, drift onward, carried by the same patient flow that shaped understanding across generations. Though the world has changed in ways early Americans could never have imagined, faint echoes of folk medicine still drift through modern life. They appear quietly, often unnoticed, woven into language, habits, and the way people think about care and wellness. These echoes do not arrive as instructions or beliefs, but as familiar ideas that feel comforting simply because they have been around for a long time. Many of the words we use today carry traces of the past. Phrases about resting it off, letting time heal, or listening to your body sound modern, yet they reflect much older ways of thinking. Long before formal systems existed, people relied on rest, patience, and observation. These ideas endured not because they were proven, but because they felt intuitively right. Modern wellness culture often emphasizes balance between activity and rest, between work and recovery, between mind and body. This focus echoes early beliefs that health depended on harmony rather than force. Even when the language has changed, the underlying idea remains familiar. The appeal of natural imagery also reflects these older traditions. People still speak of feeling grounded, centered, or out of sync. These expressions mirror earlier understandings of health as something connected to environment, rhythm, and routine. The land may no longer shape daily survival for most, but its symbolism persists. Ritual continues to play a role as well. Evening routines, morning habits, quiet moments set aside for rest. These are modern expressions of practices that once unfolded naturally. The comfort they bring does not come from explanation, but from repetition. Even the idea of wellness itself carries echoes of folk traditions. It suggests something broader than the absence of illness. It implies care, attention, and ongoing maintenance. This perspective aligns closely with earlier views, where healing was part of daily life rather than a separate event. Language surrounding comfort has remained remarkably consistent. Words like soothing, gentle, and calming have been used for generations. They point to a shared understanding that care should ease rather than overwhelm. This preference for gentleness reflects lessons learned long ago. There is also a continued fascination with origins. People often look backward, seeking meaning in tradition. This curiosity is not about returning to the past, but about understanding where ideas came from. In doing so, fragments of folk knowledge resurfaced not as practice, but as story. Modern culture values choice and customization. People explore routines that suit their own rhythms. This mirrors the earlier reality where care was personal, shaped by household and environment rather than standardization. The desire for individualized wellness has deep roots. Even skepticism carries echoes of the past. Just as early communities weighed experience over claims, modern individuals often trust what feels right to them. Personal experience remains a powerful guide, even in a world rich with information. The pace of modern life contrasts sharply with earlier eras, yet the longing for slowness persists. Quiet evenings, unplugged moments, and intentional rest reflect a desire to return to rhythms once taken for granted. These practices echo a time when stillness was unavoidable and valued. What endures most strongly is the idea that care begins close to home. While resources have expanded, the instinct to start with rest, comfort, and attention remains. This instinct connects modern life to its quieter roots. Tonight, as you reflect on these echoes, there is no need to trace them precisely. They are not meant to be followed or revived. They simply remind us that human care has always balanced knowledge with patience, and action with rest. Let these reflections drift gently, words and ideas passing softly through time. The past, whispering, not demanding attention, and as this chapter fades, allow your own thoughts to settle, carrying forward only what feels calm and familiar. As the story moves toward its final rest, as the story reaches its quiet end, the remedies that once filled kitchens and memories begin to soften, losing their sharp edges and clear outlines. They no longer ask to be remembered precisely. They no longer seek explanation or judgment. They simply settle into the past, becoming part of a wider, gentler history. What remains is not instruction, but atmosphere, a sense of how life once moved more slowly, how care unfolded without urgency, and how people responded to uncertainty with patience rather than alarm. The details fade first. The names of plants, the exact motions of preparation. The words once spoken quietly by the hearthful drift away like mist. In their place is something calmer, a feeling of steadiness, of evenings that stretched without interruption, of nights where darkness was complete and silence was familiar. These were the conditions in which those old stories lived, and they are the same conditions that invite rest, now history. When allowed to soften, becomes less about facts and more about rhythm. The rhythm of days passing, of seasons turning, of generations learning, adjusting, and eventually letting go. The old remedies belonged to their time, shaped by needs that no longer exist in the same way. There is no need to carry them forward. They have already done their work, teaching patience, observation, and care. Those lessons remain, even as the practices themselves fade into memory. As these stories rest, they join countless others. Stories of homes long gone, of hands that worked slowly and deliberately, of voices that spoke softly in lamplight. None of these need to be preserved perfectly. Their meaning survives without precision. Imagine those kitchens now, quiet and empty. The fires no longer burn. The shelves no longer hold bundles tied with twine. Dust settles gently where activity once unfolded. There is no sense of loss here, only completion. Outside, the land continues its cycles. Forests grow and change. Fields return to grass. Paths disappear. Nature does not hold on to memory in the way people do. It simply moves forward, steady and untroubled. And so, too, can the mind. There is nothing left to analyze. Nothing left to learn. The story has reached a place where understanding gives way to rest. Thoughts may still drift for a while, as they often do. Images may rise and fade, soft light, familiar rooms, quiet evenings. Let them come and go without following them. There is no need to stay awake for them. Breathing slows naturally now. The body recognizes the calm. Muscles release their holding. The day loosens its grip completely. These old stories do not need attention anymore. They are content to rest where they are folded gently into history. You can leave them here, knowing they will remain without effort. As the silence deepens, the line between listening and dreaming softens. Words lose their shape. Meaning becomes sensation. The mind drifts, unanchored and light. There is nothing to prepare for. Nothing to remember. Sleep does not require permission. It arrives on its own, just as it always has. Let the past settle fully now. Let history quiet itself. Let the stories fade into a steady, comforting hush. And, as they rest, you rest, you know where of when wakefulness ends, and sleep begins, carried gently into the night, where nothing is required, and everything is calm.